Hello, my name's Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, Annie and I started Garden Masterclass 6 years ago to put on live educational events in the British Isles. But with COVID, the lockdown, in April 2020, we started doing a public service broadcast. And then we've settled down to running both live events, but also with a big online content. So we do this Thursday Garden Chat once a week on a Thursday evening, 6 o'clock Western European time. And those recordings then go up on to YouTube. Now, we also do webinars. We have a webinar season that runs through from September to May. We get leading experts globally from the garden and landscape world to talk about their specialism. And of course, that's an opportunity to ask them questions. Most of those webinars are recorded and are then available through Vimeo from our website. We also put on courses. There's a course on naturalistic planting design, for example, which I do with Professor Nigel Dunnett of the University of Sheffield in Northern England. And we sometimes get involved in organising conferences. We do all sorts of things that are aimed at encouraging quality planting, quality gardening, knowledge about plants and botany, plant science, and we hope you'll join us. We have a membership scheme which gives you discounts on our webinars and live events and various other goodies, but also you can just sign up for our monthly email newsletter to keep in touch with what we're doing. We believe, and we've been told by many people, that what we do is unique. It's unique in the range and quality of people we talk to and our global reach and our diversity. So hope you enjoy this particular episode and do come back for more.
Yes.
Right, thank you, Annie. Thank you. We're going to the Royal Horticultural Society garden at Wisley in Surrey tonight, which I'm sure most of you, if you haven't actually been there, I'm sure you know of it. My relationship with Wisley, I am actually old enough to remember Wisley before the M25 motorway.
I thought you were about to say you were older than Wisley. Oh, wonderful. Sorry. Couldn't resist.
My father was a member of the RHS in the days when you couldn't just be a member of the RHS, you were a fellow and you had to be sort of chosen. And I sort of vaguely, dimly remember going to Wisley because I was quite planty as a teenager, a sort of misspent teenage youth growing rare bulbs and cyclamen and
a nerd is what you're trying to say.
A nerd, yes, Annie. I don't know what you were up to at that age, Annie.
Riding horses. That's what I was doing.
Riding horses.
I was a horsey nerd. Yeah.
You were a pony girl. Well,
I was a pony girl. No, I was a horse girl. Never got on with ponies.
I was a plant nerd. Anyway, Wisley was one of those places, and then of course they opened up the M25, and they kind of the retired middle classes of the southeast of England descended in their Volvos en masse, and the place has never been the same since. And I went through quite a long period of finding the place terribly kind of stiff and didactic and kind of over-maintained. And then probably about 15 years ago at least, I started doing some workshops there, which was usually on some theme of ecological planting design. And every time I did this, I found myself gravitating towards the same part of the garden, which is Oakwood, which is the part of the garden where there is a lot of real ecological process happening. And over the years, and this might be something interesting to talk to our guest about, but certainly the management of Wisley has just got a lot more relaxed over the last few years. But certainly in terms of Oakwood, I then did some research and discovered that in fact Oakwood is pretty much the oldest example of ecological planting we have. It goes back really, a very long way. And I've always found it just the most incredibly fascinating place. So my last visit to Wisley back in the summer, I was very pleased to meet Jack Aldridge, who had just been appointed as I'm not quite sure what the correct term is, sort of manager of Oakwood, and he's going to talk to us about it, and then we'll have a conversation about the management of this really quite special part of a very special garden. So, Jack, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
What is actually your job title?
I'm the horticulturalist responsible for Wisley, I suppose. Yeah, we'll stick with that.
Yes. Now we'll ask the question we always ask when we kick off with these things. How did you get into plants and gardening?
That is a good question. I think misspent youth. That can relate to that.
Yes.
So I grew up. My parents were, I'd say, interested in gardens and encouraged me to garden from a young age. And I think certainly from about 10, I can remember really being sort of hooked on plants, and plants were all I was thinking about, and all my spare time was absorbed with plants, and had an allotment and grew vegetables and did that thing, and then I did that for a bit, and then got interested in ornamental plants, I grew up around the corner from the Hillier Gardens, the Hillier Arboretum, and used to visit there regularly, and that's where I sort of realised that trees and shrubs and woody plants were what really interested me, and obviously that's one of the best collections of woody plants in Europe, if not the world, and was spoiled in having that sort of round the corner from a young age, and did some volunteering as a teenager at a little National Trust garden near Winchester, where I grew up, and a place called Hinton Ampner, and that's where I kind of realised that horticulture could be a job, and met some wonderful, really encouraging people there that kind of took me under their wing and taught me everything they knew about plants. It was a small garden with quite a lot going on, lots of just a little bit of everything really, and was exposed to a little bit of everything, and sort of that was my first kind of realization that horticulture could be a career, and they were the people that encouraged me to apply to Wisley, I applied as a student on the student program, the Wisley diploma, 4 years ago now, and that was quite an eye-opening and wonderful experience.
Yes. So that must have been, well, as you say, a very special experience. Could you perhaps just describe what the training covers, what you do, give us some idea of
Yeah. So the Wisley diploma is the longest-running horticultural training program that the RHS has run, really, to my knowledge, and they take 10 horticultural students a year for 2 years, and you live and work at Wisley for the duration of those 2 years, and spend effectively 3 months with every team within the garden. The garden is split up into geographic areas and different teams responsible for them, and you work on this rotation around the garden, and get to kind of soak up all the knowledge and experience of that team, and experience the plant collections in that area, and then you move on to the next one, and you work in this kind of rotation over the course of the 2 years. And then we have lectures from lecturers from all over the UK, and really fantastic, fascinating lectures, and there's a sort of coursework element to it, and exams at the end of it. So it's living and breathing plants for a whole very intense 2 years, which was wonderful.
Yeah, what was the division like between kind of theoretical desk book work and actually being out in the garden?
It was, because it was a sort of full-time paid role, as well as being, a student placement. We were, 5 days a week, most weeks, day to day in the garden, and then the sort of the desk-based stuff came from about now until the small hours of the evening, most evenings, up until deadlines, and then it was a sort of it was both simultaneously, packing it all in.
What was your favourite bit of the garden to work in?
This is where I'm supposed to say Oakwood, isn't it? But
you're allowed to say something else. Yes.
but I came to Wisley with a sort of inkling that trees and shrubs and woody plants were my interest, and then got to spend 3 months in the main woodland garden on Battleston Hill in the spring at magnolia, camellia, rhododendron time, and that was just that sealed the deal for me. That woody plants were what I wanted to spend my horticultural career sort of somewhat specialising in. But obviously Oakwood has, as you've touched on already, it's a fascinating part of the garden and so different to everything else I was seeing, all the other parts of the garden I was being exposed to, and found it was a really interesting. It was not like another garden I'd worked in.
No.
Whereas so other parts of Wisley are sort of emulated elsewhere. This was quite a unique little pocket.
Yes. I mean, I must admit, I'm not so familiar with Battleston Hill, but I spent a very wet day the summer before last, actually doing a whole lot of data collection, which involved poking around every corner of Battleston Hill, which I just realised was just absolutely vast. I found all sorts of things.
Lots of corners,
lots of funny little corners, and kind of finding these
Absolutely.
enormous kind of spreading mats of various kind of fairly obscure woodland perennials, which was just the kind of thing I was hoping to find, because I've got this whole long project of researching the long-term plant performance, and so but none of it sort of meshed together, whereas Oakwood is like, you really feel this is a dynamic, highly complex plant community. So perhaps I could ask you which was your least favorite part of the garden to work in, but I'm not going to, so I think we should head straight to your presentation.
Yeah, right. I'll my screen. There we are. So Oakwood is. I should explain that I obviously did the 2-year diploma, and then sort of around the sort of last few months of my final year, a job came up to look after Oakwood. The horticulturist that had been managing it for the sort of past 7 years was moving on to something else, and I talk about right place at the right time. What an exciting part of the garden, exciting but somewhat daunting part of the garden to be taking on, not least because it is the oldest bit of Wisley, the original garden, if you like. So it's a 4.5 acre woodland garden. This is the view of Oakwood from the top of the rock garden, looking down upon it. You can see the canopy there with its various layers and different sort of topography and the network of paths within it. And so 4.5 acres of woodland garden that was bought by a man called George Ferguson Wilson in 1878, and he bought the land as part of what has now become the rest of Wisley, a sort of 60 acre package of what is farmland, with this 4.5 acres of oak woodland in the middle. And he was not a horticulturalist by trade. He was a scientist and businessman and worked elsewhere, but had spent a lot of the years leading up to that building and creating a garden called Heatherbank near Weybridge, which is just around the corner from Wisley. So when this land came up, he saw this as an opportunity. You don't see the chance to buy a decent size area of mature, established oak woodland with 2 foot of leaf mold on the surface of all the soil and with natural ponds and ditches. He saw this as an opportunity and a challenge to be able to create this sort of microclimate, all the necessary microclimates to grow difficult plants well, and that was his sort of ethos. And obviously, this is the late 19th century. This is a time of great introduction of interesting plants, both herbaceous and woody. So, because he'd been gardening for much of his life, he was already sort of in those horticultural circles and had friendly with people like Ellen Wilmot and E.A. Bowles and many others. He was in that sort of tight-knit group, so all these interesting new plants were coming his way, and sort of in that privileged group. So Oakwood was the site that he chose to sort of set about growing some of these things. And there's an aerial shot of it. You can see that's Oakwood today. If we're within the context of Wisley, you've got the glass house to the east, to the west of Oakwood, the rock garden to the south, which is this bit at the bottom, sort of bottom left of the picture, 7 acres beyond. And it is slap bang in the middle of the garden. It is the heart of the garden, the historic core, as we call it. And you can see it's a typical woodland garden for the most part, with the typical layers you'd expect to find in a woodland of high canopy trees, of largely oaks, and then small trees and shrubs making up that mid-story, and then as Noel has already alluded to, complex sort of interplay of herbaceous perennials, ephemerals, and bulbs, and evergreen ground covers that make up the sort of the ground flora. So you have everything. It's probably the most diverse area of planting in Wisley, in the fact that it has these layers, and each layer itself is this complex matrix of a diversity of plants. So this is George Ferguson Wilson. I have to, ashamed to say, I don't quite have the sideburns to match yet, but one day maybe. And he, he was a contemporary of William Robinson, who wrote famously The Wild Garden, gardening at Gravetye Manor in Sussex, and he was creating a garden that was very much sort of very much in a similar style to what Robinson was doing at Gravetye, in this sort of naturalistic style of garden, of wild gardening. And Robinson even mentions what Ferguson Wilson was doing at Wisley in his book The Wild Garden, and talks about it being a very interesting wild wood. So they were doing a similar sort of thing they were doing, but focusing on different groups of plants and trying to do different things. This is an early picture of Oakwood as it was from the collection in the Lindley Library, and you can see early plantings of rhododendrons and camellias making that sort of evergreen mid-story with a lot of the original oaks extant, and these sort of loose paths since been upgraded and replaced. But this is very much what the sort of typical feel, the sort of the feel of Oakwood would have been when Ferguson Wilson was gardening there. And it's not dissimilar now. Maybe the plants themselves might have changed in some cases, but it's still gardened very much in a similar way to the way Wilson was gardening. And I should mention, of course, Wilson. We think of Wilson in the world of plants in the late 19th, early 20th century. Everyone naturally thinks of Ernest Wilson, the great plant hunter, but this is the forgotten Wilson, if you like, and obviously doing different things, but an equally significant figure, I think. So in terms of the site, it's at the bottom of a slope, and in a naturally low-lying part of the garden. So the water table is very high, so good, naturally good soil moisture the year round. And in order to mitigate that, he dug ponds and ditches in order to create these different microclimates. And by the end of his sort of time gardening in Oakwood, he sort of, I remember reading, he brags in an article in Gardener's Chronicles, he had 8 distinct different soil types that he'd managed to manipulate across the site in order to grow different plants in different places with different requirements. So many of the ponds and ditches are still there today and still very important, because otherwise, without them, the site would be underwater for much of the year. The garden would be underwater for much of the year, and somewhat limits the range of plants you can grow. So while also providing a sort of interesting a set of conditions to grow a whole other range of plants. So you can see the things like Caltha palustris in the foreground, and Lysochiton americanus, the skunk cabbage, and these great mounds. I'd love to know how all these sort of clumps of Osmunda regalis just unfurling here are, and the royal fern, fantastic, with things like anemone nemerosa is naturalized pretty much throughout Oakwood, and then damper areas, things like Fritillaria milagris and the snake's head fritillary in April flowering, and they just seed around in this. And then what you're seeing here is a very typical. The ground layer is very much flat. It's largely herbaceous with some green components to it, but you've got this. It's very much flat at the beginning of the year. And you've got all these ephemerals and bulbs emerging from the ground layer early in the year, and then they're covered over by the subsequent layers of later flowering herbaceous, sort of the late spring, and then things that continue later into summer. But this is the sort of planting that George Ferguson Wilson was after. Growing difficult plants well, things like Trillium chloropetalum, the giant wake robin, a difficult plant to grow in normal border conditions. And you have to remember that when he was gardening in the 1870s, borders were traditional herbaceous double borders largely, with exclusively herbaceous material, often late flowering, sort of summer flowering, or if you were gardening with shrubs, they'd be in a shrub border, exclusively shrubs, which were dug over. The border would be dug over, it'd be bare soil between the shrubs, and there was none of this integration that obviously William Robinson and others have sort of brought about, and Wilson was doing much the same thing. But Trillium chloropetalum, we still fortunate to have big clumps of that. Whether they're extant from Wilson's original planting, we don't know, but other things that he talks about growing well are Narcissus cyclaminaeus, the species that has sort of the parent of the popular tete and other cyclaminaeus hybrids. But this loves the damp conditions, particularly around the ponds. You can see it self-sown into the Osmunda crowns here, with this is Cornus canadensis that's running around, little stoloniferous North American cornus that gets to no more than sort of 15 centimeters high and makes this loose evergreen ground cover. There it is in flower a bit later in the year. But these are just some examples of the choice things that Wilson was growing or trying to grow well in what is acidic soil, with good moisture, and then using shrubs and trees to create these different microclimates which allow these things to grow well. Things like shortiers. We don't currently have any shortiers in Oakwood. These are the sort of these little treasures that we might come across a little pan of in an alpine house or in a collection somewhere. But these were things that he was propagating and growing in great mats of Galax urceolata, for example, and sort of interwoven with vacciniums and gaultherias and all this sort of ericaceous loving woodland flora, which we think of these things as small treasures and rare plants now, but this was a time when that material was available in greater quantity for adventurous gardeners like him to play around with. Irises were a great love of his, and something we continue to. We still have a good collection of irises in Oakwood, and they're wonderfully complementary to all the sort of that kind of late May flowering shrubby material, things like azaleas you can see in the background. He particularly particularly grew iris insata, the Japanese water iris, which would have been very new to cultivation at the time. And he was sent seed from Japan, which he raised in great numbers, and was the first, I think, reported to be the first person to grow it successfully outside in the UK, to my knowledge. Perhaps others were trying it at the same time, but and found the perfect niche for it at sort of the edge of these ponds and ditches, and they created quite a display. Unfortunately, in Sartas, they're more difficult to grow than some of their relatives. This is Iris sibirica, and we have a good collection of Iris sibirica cultivars. But Iris insata is a plant that we'd like to grow more. We've got sort of bits and pieces still of, and we need to propagate them and bulk them up and do something more with them. And this is we'll touch on that when we talk about management in a bit, and the ups and downs of Oakwood's past. So this is an area that we call the Iris Terrace. Whether Wilson grew irises here, we don't know, but there's various different Sibirica cultivars, and you can see this weeping taxodium here. And in the background, a couple of interesting trees. This is Eucryphia glutinosa, again, late flowering, ericaceous, acid-loving shrub, and the very rare Franklinia alata maha, sort of autumn flowering camellia relative there, deciduous camellia relative. Not a very good picture of it, but it's those are two important Oakwood plants. Primulas were another nest that Wilson was attempting to grow in ways that others hadn't attempted before, and particularly the Asiatic candelabra primulas, and these big deep beds of humus-rich, moisture-retentive soil made primula growing. It meant that primulas really lended themselves to the site, and they're now sort of become somewhat weed in places. So things like the wonder, I love Primula pulverenta. That's probably my favorite candelabra species, with this white sort of farina on the flower stems. But that self sows around, and rather than planting it in specific areas, we manage the seedlings and sort of so we want to let them much in the same way with a lot of things. We let things put themselves where they want to, and I can imagine that was a very similar way to the way that Wilson would have been gardening the area, rather than having specific beds of primulas and irises separately. There was sort of this interplay between things and allowing things to sort of seed where they wanted to. And then, so looking up now into sort of the canopy, we've got things like wisteria and rambling roses that decorate the canopy of oaks. This is an old oak monolith of an oak that had to be taken down, and just allowing things like wisteria to grow up them and cover them completely, and growing climbers into other shrubs. That's something that Robinson was probably the first to advocate, and having a lot of fun with it, really. And you end up looking into a huge mature oak in the middle of May, and you're sort of met with this wonderful sight of this wisteria allowed to do absolutely what it wants to do, and just grow in every direction for meters and meters and meters, and then reaches the end extremities of the branches, stops growing, and then begins to flower its head off, which is quite exciting when you're looking up into that, and have rambling roses and Clematis montana, these really vigorous climbers that you don't often see in except for the biggest of gardens, and just allowing them the space and freedom to do what they want, and making the most of everything. Every plant is made the most of, in that every tree has a climber up it, or every opportunity is taken to grow something else into something else, and whereas that is not necessarily the case in other parts of Wisley. This is very much the way we choose to garden Oakwood. And then rhododendrons, obviously a classic woodland garden, acid-loving woodland garden plant. And these are two very old hardy hybrids that we think were probably likely planted by Wilson. This is Halopianum, Halopianum white pearl on the left, and pink pearl on the right. Pink pearl being a very popular rhododendron even still today. So Wilson would have planted these hardy hybrids, which are now huge trees. But we should, we obviously talk about Wilson and Wilson's role in Oakwood, but like any garden, Wilson, I should point out, Wilson died in 1902. So sort of he had 30 years of gardening in Oakwood. And it was in 1902 that Sir Thomas Hanbury bought Oakwood and the adjoining land off Wilson, and it was Hanbury that then sold it to the Royal Horticultural Society, and thus Wisley became the flagship garden of the RHS. And that's an important detail that I'd omitted. But so from there on, we continue the management of Oakwood in the RHS's hands, and continue to garden it in much a similar way to Wilson. And it was sort of a key turning point in terms of both Battleston Hill, the other woodland garden area I mentioned earlier, and Oakwood, was the appointment of Francis Hanger as curator in the late 1940s, who had been the head gardener for Lionel Rothschild at Exbury. Obviously, one of the most famous woodland gardens anywhere in England, and Exbury is sort of the type, if you like, of woodland garden that people expected to see in the sort of 1930s and 40s, and Lionel Rothschild was very much at the forefront of that, along with people like Aberconway at Bodmin, and their influence, because they're heavily involved in the RHS, their influence became felt and known, with people like Francis Hanger as curator of Wisley. He saw, again, much like Wilson, had the opportunities for Oakwood to be used to display a set of plants that suited their particular microclimate that was there, and he recognised that Oakwood, being at the bottom of the slope, was naturally a frost pocket. So a lot of the very early flowering, February, March flowering rhododendron species that had been planted there prior were not a success, and they're reliably frosted every year, and sort of thought, well, what's the point growing them? So he recognised the potential for Oakwood to be this late spring, early summer flowering woodland garden, and thus brought in big collections of azaleas, later flowering rhododendrons that he'd been breeding with Lionel Rothschild at Exbury, and was responsible for the collection of Karumi azaleas we now have, and hybridizing deciduous azaleas, and that really relished the sort of moist conditions in Oakwood. And this is Amoenum on the left here, which is a well-known Karumi azalea, and yeah, you wouldn't miss it in a hurry. It's certainly not subtle, but so that was Hanger's kind of, Francis Hanger's as sort of involvement was his interests were in rhododendrons, camellias, and magnolias, and as a result, it became known for those species and selections that filled that sort of later flowering niche. Whereas Battleston Hill had better frost drainage, and focused up there on much earlier flowering things. So we had these, it sort of established the identity of Oakwood alongside Battleston Hill as the two main woodland garden areas at Wisley. So this is just a cross section of a sort of typical Oakwood planting area in sort of mid-spring. You can see the acer foliage emerging, things like Hydrangea paniculatas kind of back this bed, and the sort of rhododendrons flowering here, Stewartia, and then you can kind of, it's not a very detailed picture, but you can see things like Euphorbia polychroma just emerging here. There's Polygonatum, Solomon's seal in the background. Things like Natutia, the shuttlecock fern, just sort of runs all through this planting, and it's just unfurling. And in a month's time from this picture, that scene would be unrecognizable and be taken over by the next layer of herbaceous planting. So we've got these two kind of areas in Oakwood. You've got this band of a sort of much lighter canopy. So specimen trees and shrubs planted throughout with these bigger pools or glades of herbaceous planting, and then where the tree cover gets denser, the further into the woodland you go, it becomes much more, the ground floor is more sort of sparse, and you end up with much more of these sort of spring flowering ephemerals like the anemone nemerosa we saw, and the trilliums that they relish the sort of dappled shade conditions. So it's not your typical traditional woodland garden in the sense you've got this high canopy that covers over the whole area with this very uniform planting of rhododendrons, camellias, magnolias, sort of repeated throughout. There are differences between them, between the areas, and this is an autumn shot. So I think Oakwood's the main season is sort of mid to late spring, but then many of the trees and shrubs and perennials come to life again in sort of October and November around now, and you get these wonderful autumn tints on a lot of the trees and shrubs, and that comes about as a result of the acidic soil. I mean, acid loving woodland genera of trees and shrubs are some, are undeniably the best for autumn colour, and you can grow things like Fothergilla major and Hamamelis, fantastic autumn colour. Others, Oxydendrum, a whole range of wonderful trees and shrubs that you couldn't grow in the open garden. Need those sort of woodland conditions and a moist acidic soil, and we struggle to grow elsewhere at Wisley, but thrive in Oakwood because of the unique. That's a flavour of Oakwood. I hope that's okay. Just a quick crop through some images that kind of encapsulate the sense of the planting in Oakwood, and now I think we'll talk about a little bit about how we manage it day to day and how it has been managed.
Yes. And I may even at some point pitch in with some pictures of my own of the ground layer, which I found absolutely fascinating. Because whenever I have done workshops at Wisley, we've usually ended up at Oakwood, and the students are set off on a task, which is to look at examples of competition, to find places where they think one particular perennial might be winning over another, but you're not quite sure. Then there might be a third element that's going to take over. What I found fascinating is the real complexity of that ground layer. On the one hand, you've got all the things that the RHS have clearly planted over the years. On the other hand, native species, and there's this wonderful sort of balance between the two. And real complexity. I would say the complexity and diversity of a natural plant community, and the diversity of the kind of plant community you might possibly find in, I don't know, the Appalachians or somewhere, which has simply a much richer flora than Britain anyway. And I think it's just a wonderful place to see competition at work. And is the vinca going to smother the lazula, or maybe not? And again, of course, there's a great patch or something like Virginia or Epimedium, where certainly something has taken over. And it looks to the outsider as if a lot of it is actually in a fairly happy state of coexistence. But I mean, from your point of view in terms of management, how does that all look? I mean, I'd love to know more about what you do and when you do it and how often you do it.
Absolutely. Well, it's been so as mentioned, I've been in the role looking after Oakwood for just over a year now, and it's been it's been a steep learning curve, because I mean it's not. I think my prior horticultural training and experience had been gardening fairly traditional herbaceous plantings of a group of one thing and a group of another thing and a group of another thing, and they're quite separate, and you might have a bulb layer, but that was sort of it, and that's quite sort of traditional herbaceous planting that you'd expect to find in most places. So coming into Oakwood with the knowledge of it being something special, and just I think more than anything, the last year I've spent just looking and watching and observing the way these things, these interplays, and the way things sort of have interacted. And I mean, from a weeding point of view, my kind of main aim, my main sort of guiding thing is you just choose the most dominant thing you take a given area and choose the most dominant thing, and kind of remove that most dominant thing at that given time, as something seeding or just going over, on the assumption that it already exists either as a herbaceous rootstock or in the seed bank, and will come back to some extent. And that seems, obviously I have not had the benefit of years to see how that's played out, and that's certainly what I understand my predecessors were doing, and something I'm continuing to do now, and seeing how it goes. Really, it's quite a challenge to sort of take Oakwood and think, right, how maintain Oakwood is a sort of, it's a difficult ask, and it's kind of something I've struggled with, and it's been definitely a steep learning curve for me, but hopefully.
Jack, could I ask about the wisteria growing up through the oak? I mean,
yes.
I mean, you've got, two very large plants. Is there any management that you do to the wisteria? I can't imagine you're pruning off, 2 shoots from the.
No.
So you just let it go. You just let it go.
Absolutely, and I mean, there comes a point when sometimes you've got to climb up a tree that's in a state of decline, and have to make the difficult decision that, okay, we can look at removing it and starting again, or perhaps, like in the case of that image of the monolith that I showed that was completely covered in wisteria. I mean, that had wisteria in the tree, and then the wisteria had to be pruned hard, and completely started again. The top of the oak was taken out for safety reasons, and then the wisteria was allowed to grow up again. And there will become a point when that central trunk will become unsafe, and we'll have to intervene. And it's sort of on that kind of basis. What you have to watch for with wisteria up trees, as I found, is it's not the bit going up the tree that you have to worry about. It's all the thousands of tendrils that are creeping along the ground and creating this dense mat. So that's what we'd go in and sort of do that in the sort of summer prune time of a professional wall-trained or pergola-trained wisteria. We'd go in and remove all those shoots.
But presumably you also have to keep an eye on the twisting stems, because I mean, we've all seen wisteria wrapped around railings,
strangulation of
So I guess you have to keep an eye of what's going on. Is it actually physically growing up the trunk, or is it coming in from the side? Or
so we have a lot of the ones that sort of more recent, when I say more recent, last 30-40 years plantings of wisteria. We have ropes that will run up the central trunk, and obviously wisteria, being twining, can't cling to the main trunk itself, so uses the rope to kind of work its way up into the canopy. Or as I've seen it in other gardens, and possibly more effective, a way of doing it is planting a wisteria sort of at the drip line, and having a single string that goes up to the sort of outermost branches, and using that way, because then you've got the wisteria away from the main kind of root zone of the tree, less competition, not that you need to worry about vigor. They just grow.
No, it's fascinating, and I'm intrigued about why you gravitated towards woody as opposed to herbaceous. What is it about woody that appeals to you?
That is a good question, because I'm not sure really. I don't think it's unfair to say that we're in quite a sort of herbaceous dominated era within horticulture. I don't know if that's the best way of putting it, but
no, it's true.
And herbaceous perennials sort of are rightly popular. But I've always, there's something about.
Do you think they're the unsung heroes? Do you think
they're maybe a little bit? Yeah, I don't know. Particularly shrubs. I think shrubs get about. I mean, there's the sort of tree brigade, if you like. There are people that love veteran trees and big trees, and I put myself in that group. But then shrubs and climbers, to some extent, are that kind of forgotten.
They are, and I think designers have forgotten about them too. I think there's shrubs, and then there's really interesting shrubs, and
absolutely.
That brings me to how I met you, because it was Caroline Jackson, the wonderful Caroline Jackson, who said to us about a year ago, "You've got to meet this young man called Jack Aldridge. He's amazing." And then I came along to White House Farm for the Philadelphus Day, not knowing what to expect, back in June, July, whenever it was, and got there, and then just couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, there were all the plant nerds from the planet in a very small space, arguing about different plants, but there was this table, and I don't mean a little table, I mean a long trestle table, groaning under however many varieties of Philadelphus, let's say 20, 30, 35, it was enormous. Wonderful. And it was the most exciting day. And then, of course, to walk around with Maurice Foster and go around the Arboretum was just incredible. But that's when I first actually met you. And, and I can see, Woody has, it is an incredible range, and somebody championing them, to have someone championing them is fantastic, really.
And I think there are these people, you mentioned Maurice Foster and people like Roy Lancaster and the people of that era, that generation, these are kind of my people I'm fortunate enough to call friends and my mentors and heroes and all the rest of it. But they, they've been championing woody plants for careers, and I just see this opportunity now with the way people are looking at herbaceous plantings to consider that from a shrubby point of view. Reconsider shrubs, and I think as part of that, it's not only capturing the knowledge about the plants themselves and their whole history and all the rest of it, but then there's an opportunity to really look at how you can use them, and that's sort of uncharted, it feels like uncharted territory to some extent, and that is exciting.
There's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing going on, because for people to use more shrubs and more interesting and unusual shrubs, they have to be available. And if people don't know about them and can't get them, and I mean, I know there's just a handful of nurseries. I mean, I've always got the Burncoose catalogue in my hand, because at least you can look. I mean, at least, and then Bluebell Arboretum. At least you can look outside the norm, but unless your average Wyvale or whatever is starting to stock Deutzias or Colquitzia or something like that, rather than just lots of Choisias and Eve Price, that kind of thing.
Or if it is, something like a Deutzia, it's the same four that everyone knows.
Absolutely.
And you lose that kind of the diversity of that genus, and we can all get, like you alluded to, we can all get nerdy about the difference between different species, and that's all good fun in its own right. But actually, we need to think about what are going to be good garden plants, and what and the ones that aren't necessarily as well known. They're not unpopular; they're just not known, like you say, and it's bringing those to the attention of everyone. I'm bringing those to the fore. And kind of highlighting how valuable they can be. But as part of that is something that Noel and I were talking about when we came to Wisley in the summer, is the way you use them as part of the whole mixed ecological planting. And that's something I'm keen to do more of in Oakwood. I mean, Oakwood is an experiment. Wilson set it up as an experimental garden, and it's nice to be somewhere that we can continue to experiment with things, looking at ways that we can integrate shrubs with the herbaceous layers in a bigger way, to show that can be done, if it can be done. I don't think we're working it out. We're sort of
And you mentioned
what I'd like to bring us back to Oakwood. One thing I'd like to ask is, what sort of record keeping is there? I mean, I was thinking, for example, of asking you, what are the problem plants, and apart from the obvious ground elder, whether there's any plants there. But are you able to draw on the experience of previous staff? I mean, what are records like?
There are some records, and certainly from the last 7 years. So. There were two chaps before me that sort of taken on Oakwood in a state of which it had a few years of kind of not unmanaged, but less emphasis on it than perhaps there might have been after that. And they picked it up in a state of somewhat neglect, and did a lot of really important pruning work and sort of clearing. Things like rhododendron ponticum that had started to take hold again, and just generally, literally uncovering paths that had sort of hadn't seen the light of day for 10 years. There was this not period of mismanagement, but just a sort of the priority within the garden. Sort of a big dynamic garden like Wisley, so much happening, and emphasis gets put on different areas at different times, as you'd expect. And I think they picked it up at an important time in which it sort of had that not period of neglect, but things
reduced management,
reduced management, and things had started to slip as a result. So they picked it up and did a huge amount of important work, which I'm incredibly, to take it on at this stage is indebted to them for that. And clearing, mats of ivy out of pre-existing herbaceous planting, and redefining paths and that sort of thing. So that and you know they've recently moved on to other things, so I can still talk to them about sort of that experience. But prior to that, there's this sort of there is a big gap really between then and I guess Wilson's articles in Gardens Chronicles, which is the late 1800s. So there is a gap, and little bits of sort of historical archive we can kind of piece stuff together from that, but not so much from a management point of view. It's sort of you know what plants were there and roughly where they were maybe, and what people were doing in different ways, but there isn't a sort of grand management plan for it.
And is there anything that you're dying to plant there? Is there anything that you think this is what it really needs?
What a question.
If you could do anything tomorrow and plant what you wanted, I think there's something lacking.
Oh God, this is a very hard question. Again, it's kind of continuing to remain true to what is there already, but also adding new things and not getting too carried away with one's current obsessions on a particular genus. I mean, hydrangeas, for example, are exciting, and I'm trying to, again, they suit that kind of late flowering niche.
And
it does need. I mean, it does peak. I must say, early summer.
Absolutely. And some recent plantings of hydrangea aspera in particular, have done really well. And we're trying to add, address sort of address gaps in the Wisley's general plant collection, and hydrangea serrata is such an unsung species. So trying to plant more with those and see how I can integrate. They can be nicely integrated in with rhododendron plantings, for example. You've got a big evergreen blob of a rhododendron, and by raising its crown just ever so slightly, you can underplant with hydrangea serratas, which are far more tolerant than other species, of all sorts of dry and wet and cold, and will flower usefully in that sort of July-August period, and continue to look good, for a long season with their seed heads and colour nicely in autumn. So hydrangea serrata is something I'm gone a bit mad on this year. No, they do fill a useful niche, and something I should. You touched on reduced management, Noel, and 4.5 acres of herbaceous planting is a big area to look after. For sort of for one person, more or less. So looking at ways that we can use shrubs to reduce that, to cover ground and reduce the sort of intensive management, so that then we can really focus on making the best of specific areas of more complex dynamic planting that needs more intervention more regularly. But gosh, lots of things that are waiting to go in, and I'd like to put in. I won't go too much into all of that. No, it's exciting, and a nice thing about Wisley and working for the people that I do is a lot of trust and sort of freedom to explore my own interests in plants and what I think, a lot of freedom to sort of do what I think is best, and that's a really nice position to be in, rather than obviously it is a historic garden in the same way that a lot of other historic gardens are historic gardens, but then it's nice to have the freedom and flexibility as part of our sort of general ethos. That means I can play around with things and explore these ideas.
One wonders actually what the seed bank is like. I mean, this has been all sorts of interesting plants put in over decades. I remember when I was researching it a couple of years ago, there was a lot of reference to quite a bit of the 20th century being taken up with trying to go lilies en masse, which clearly hasn't succeeded. I mean, Lilium is a funny, tricky genus, and sometimes they just take off. But most of the times they just don't. And I kind of imagine that every now and again some real rarity that's been lost for decades will suddenly appear from disturbing the soil. I mean, does that happen, or is that a bit of a
well, lilies. So to start with lilies, I forgot. I didn't mention earlier, but there were a lot of genera that Wilson was playing around with, and lilies were a key genus. He was the lily king at one time, and grew something like 60 species, and a lot of them really difficult to cultivate. Things like Lilium rubellum and Lilium japonicum, these huge pink trumpets. You know, you're lucky to see a single stem in a sort of Lily Geeks collection of that, and he had great big patches of it, which is extraordinary. Suffice to say, no such surviving examples of Lilium japonicum in Oakwood. As much as I would like to try and reintroduce it, but I don't. Lilies are difficult, not least because we have a bad problem with lily beetle. So even if we can get them established in the conditions, then the things are mown to the ground by lily beetle, which is tricky, and trying to manage that in a sustainable way in the sort of the current way of thinking. I mean, you know, lily growers will spray with anything they can spray with, and that's great, but we're not going to do that on a sort of obvious reasons. But going back to your question, things you do get sort of interesting things popping up all the time, and I don't remember in the sort of 5 years, I guess, overall that I've known Oakwood, I don't ever remember seeing Trillium sprengeri, that very late flowering red species of June flowering. And then we did an area last year, and there were obviously 4 small, because they take 3-5 years from seed to flower. There were obviously seedlings in amongst some other planting that we'd either cut back or cleared, because we had 4 flowers that appeared from nowhere, just in this little patch, surrounded by, sort of hemmed in by epimediums and other things, and typical epimedium parautricum, which we've got everywhere, that slowly creeps across the.
Yes, that is a bit of a suffocator. That one.
It is a suffocator, a huge thug, and we're trying to reduce that, or certainly move it to areas that and really testing it in completely inhospitable.
I'd say it's worse than ground elder in a way.
It is.
Yeah, but in the right place, Noel. In the right place, it's not.
But I mean, it's in terms of its sort of competitive behaviour, the sort of thinking of this balance, this coexistence, this place is good. I remember sort of walking through it, were the 2 things that I felt were most, winning the battle of competition with bad results were certain epimediums and vinca.
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah. We have had a question. We've had a question come in. Curious about Oakwood's use of native trees and shrubs. Does that fold or hold in with the collection? So is there a strong lean or not?
That's a good question. That is a good question. So I mean, the backbone of Oakwood, the oak in Oakwood, is an extant planting of native Quercus robur, and they are important, and we're trying to obviously encourage that. We've got sort of several 100-year-old examples which are fantastic, and they should be preserved and kept going for as long as we can. But obviously we like a lot of gardens in the southeast of England, we were not we fell foul of the 1987 storm, storms around that time. So a lot of the big oak canopy was lost. But
if I could interrupt now, it was Jim
Gardner,
Jim Gardner, who said to me that actually most of what Oakwood now is subdominant oaks because so many were lost.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few good original surviving examples, but most are replacements either from before that time or subsequently. So as part of the looking after a woodland garden management, one of the most important elements is canopy management, and having that constant sort of succession of canopy trees, with good prospects, good headroom, to make to make future canopy trees. But as part of that, so natives is one thing, and native Quercus robur, that's what's been there the whole time, and we've got various examples of various ages. But I mean, I've sort of, there's this conflict here, because as much as we want to be growing natives, I think we need to be thinking about a future climate, which natives may not be climatically fit to grow in the southeast of England. So and as part of that, I think with obviously there's a lot of work being done at the moment, and it's a hugely exciting time as far as that's concerned, to sort of to determine what will grow and what will be good. But I think in the meantime, I don't think it's it'd be wrong to advise planting as much diversity as possible. So we've got this oak canopy, and oaks are great trees in woodland gardens. In terms of company, because they're deep rooting, unlike betulas or circidophyllum or sycamores, for example, that are surface rooting, and will sort of make it very difficult to grow anything within their shade. Oaks are deep rooting, and means that other trees and shrubs, smaller trees and shrubs, and then everything kind of cascading down from there can associate them with much more closely. So Quercus as a genus is great, but then looking at how we can grow other species of oak to mitigate the fact that we've got various pest and disease problems, or if Quercus robur suddenly started to suffer from something unprecedented on the horizon, that we've got other species that could take their place as canopy trees, and you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. So we found that a lot of the American red oaks do really well in Oakwood, and a lot of them were put in after '87, and are really thriving, and will be the sort of, they are coming on, and in large cases overtaking the Quercus robur that are going backwards, and so it's a difficult balance with natives. Sorry, I've kind of got about this question in
it doesn't help that actually the British tree flora is an extremely restricted one compared to many parts of the world.
That's the elephant in the room.
Expectations are not huge,
Absolutely.
I mean, you can find in 1 acre of the southern Appalachians as many species as you'll find in the whole of northern Europe or something, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, there's that famous mountain in China, Imeshan in Sichuan. It's more, I think they have something like double the flora on that one mountain than the entirety of the British Isles, which I think is well, wonderful for them.
Oh, Jack, it's been brilliant having you, and it will come as no surprise to everybody that we've asked Jack to do more with us in the future. So watch this space, because we're very excited. So I know I'm going to be talking to Jack tomorrow about future plans. So yes, thank you so much, Jack, for giving up.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. Cheers.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
Look forward to it. Yeah,
well, take care and speak to you tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah, speak to you tomorrow. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Noel.
Bye, Jack.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.